Hey there. Tonight, we're diving into something that'll make your modern job complaints seem absolutely ridiculous. We're stepping back to feudal Japan, where people earned their rice by doing things that would make your HR department spontaneously combust. And you probably won't make it through the next hour without questioning everything you thought about workplace dignity. So, now, kill the overhead lights, maybe light a candle, and let's get into some history. Welcome. You are in the opulent chambers of the Heian court, around the year 1100. The silk screens shimmer in candlelight. Incense burns in elaborate bronze holders. And somewhere in these perfumed holes, a man is getting paid to smell farts. Not just any farts, mind you, aristocratic farts, the finest farts in all of Japan. Meet the professional fart smeller, or as they were more diplomatically known, digestive health consultants. These weren't desperate peasants stumbling into unfortunate career paths. These were trained specialists who understood that in a world where your bowel movements could determine your political future, someone needed to keep tabs on what was happening in the imperial intestines. The pay was surprisingly good too. A skilled digestive consultant could earn more than a low-ranking samurai, and they enjoyed certain protections under court law. Assaulting a fart smeller was considered an offense against the medical profession, which tells you something about how seriously this whole enterprise was taken. The tools of the trade were equally sophisticated. Professional fart smellers carried small silk fans to better direct aromas toward their trained nostrils, tiny bronze vessels containing various herbs to cleanse their palate between sessions, and detailed charts correlating different scents with various medical conditions. Some even carried small mirrors, not for vanity, but to observe the subject's facial expressions during a mission, which apparently provided crucial diagnostic context. The social dynamics were fascinating and deeply uncomfortable. Imagine being a court noble who needed to schedule regular appointments to have your digestive outputs professionally analyzed. The etiquette alone must have been nightmarish. Do you make small talk while someone evaluates your intestinal function? Do you apologize for poor performance? The surviving court manuals are frustratingly silent on these crucial social protocols. What makes this job particularly surreal is how it intersected with Japanese concepts of purity and pollution. Normally, bodily functions were considered spiritually polluting, requiring ritual cleansing. But professional fart smellers existed in this weird liminal space, where their pollution exposure was considered medically necessary and thus spiritually acceptable. They were ritually impure by choice for the greater good of aristocratic digestive health. The decline of professional fart smellers coincided with increased contact with Chinese medical practices, which focused more on pulse reading and less on gaseous analysis. By the late Heian period, most digestive consultants had retrained as more conventional medical practitioners, though some rural courts apparently maintained the tradition well into the Kamakura period. But perhaps the strangest aspect of this profession was its complete normalization within court culture. Contemporary poems and literature reference digestive consultants with the same casual tone they might mention flower arrangers or musicians. There's something deeply unsettling about a society so hierarchical that even your bodily functions require professional oversight, yet so accepting that nobody seemed to find any of this particularly weird. And that's just the beginning of our journey through feudal Japan's most bizarre occupations. Because if professional fart smelling seems strange, wait until you hear about the people whose entire job was memorizing the sleeping patterns of entire neighborhoods, then running through the streets at dawn, calling out individual names to wake specific people at precisely the right moment. The job required genuine skill. A master fart smeller could detect everything from dietary indiscretions to serious illness through careful olfactory analysis. They knew the difference between the robust aroma of a nobleman who'd been enjoying too much fermented fish versus the concerning notes that suggested intestinal parasites. And yes, intestinal parasites were a legitimate concern when your entire political career depended on maintaining the appearance of divine health. The training process was surprisingly rigorous. Apprentice fart smellers spent years developing their palates, or should we say, their noses. They studied under masters who could identify specific foods consumed up to 3 days prior, detect the early stages of dysentery, and even determine emotional states through gaseous emissions. Anxiety, they claimed, produced a distinctly sharp note, while contentment yielded more mellow, rounded aromas. But here's where it gets really bizarre. These consultants weren't just passive sniffers. They provided detailed reports, written reports. Imagine being the court scribe tasked with recording. His lordship's morning emission displayed notes of pickled radish with concerning undertones of spiritual imbalance. These documents were filed away with the same care as military intelligence, because in many ways, that's exactly what they were. Speaking of precisely timed bodily functions, let's talk about people whose entire existence revolved around other people's sleep schedules. Before alarm clocks, before church bells, before roosters even, there were human alarm clocks. And their job was infinitely more complicated than just making noise at dawn. These weren't your garden variety town criers, shouting general wake-up calls. These were precision specialists who memorized the individual sleep requirements of hundreds of people across multiple neighborhoods. They knew that the rice merchant needed to wake at the hour of the tiger to prepare for the morning market, that the courtesan 3 blocks over required exactly 2 warnings, spaced 15 minutes apart, and that the elderly tea master would fly into a murderous rage if awakened before hearing the temple bell's 3rd ring. The memory skills required were genuinely impressive. A master dawn runner, or Jikoku Yobidashi as they were formerly known, could navigate a mental map of an entire district, complete with who lived where, what time they needed to wake, how they preferred to be awakened, and what their backup plans were if they didn't respond to the first call. This wasn't just shouting names into the pre-dawn darkness. This was a sophisticated urban service industry. The training process started young, often with children as apprentices, who would shadow experienced dawn runners for years. They learned not just routes and timing, but the subtle art of vocal projection. A proper wake-up call needed to penetrate wooden walls and sliding screens without disturbing neighboring households. Too quiet, and your client oversleeps and loses their livelihood. Too loud, and you wake the wrong people, who then spend their day plotting your demise. But here's where the job gets truly bizarre. These human alarm clocks also served as informal neighborhood intelligence networks. They knew who was sleeping where, who wasn't sleeping at home, who was having trouble sleeping, and who had been drinking too much sake the night before. A skilled dawn runner could read an entire district's social dynamics through bedroom windows and morning response patterns. The pay structure was surprisingly complex. Clients paid monthly fees based on how precise their wake-up requirements were. Simple dawn calls were cheap. Multiple timed warnings cost extra. Special requests, like waking someone only after confirming their spouse was still asleep, or providing gentle musical wake-ups for children, commanded premium rates. Some dawn runners developed specialties, like therapeutic wake-ups for people with melancholy, or energetic military-style calls for samurai preparing for battle. The tools were minimal, but crucial. Most dawn runners carried small wooden clappers to create rhythmic sounds, tiny bells for musical wake-ups, and lengths of silk cord for measuring distances in the dark. Some developed signature calling styles, melodic verses, rhythmic chants, or even personalized songs for regular clients. The truly elite could modulate their voices to sound like different people, useful when clients needed to believe their wake-up call came from a family member rather than a paid professional. Weather presented constant challenges. Rain muffled voices and made navigation treacherous. Snow altered familiar landmarks. Wind carried voices in unexpected directions, potentially waking the wrong households and creating neighborhood conflicts. Professional dawn runners developed elaborate contingency plans, including networks of backup callers and emergency shelter arrangements. The social status was oddly complex. Dawn runners were essential service providers, respected for their reliability and discretion. But they were also privy to incredibly intimate information about their clients' lives. They knew about affairs, financial troubles, family disputes, and health problems. This knowledge made them simultaneously valuable and dangerous, leading to an elaborate code of professional ethics that governed their behavior. Some scholars debate whether dawn running was actually a cover for espionage networks. The systematic intelligence gathering, the detailed knowledge of household patterns, the ability to move freely through neighborhoods in darkness, it all seems suspiciously perfect for gathering information about potential political targets. Contemporary records hint at dawn runners who worked for competing daimyo, though the evidence remains frustratingly incomplete. The decline came gradually, starting with the introduction of mechanical timepieces in larger cities. But even as late as the mid-Edo period, rural areas and smaller towns still relied heavily on human alarm clocks. Some adapted by expanding into related services, message delivery, small package transport, even serving as informal matchmakers, based on their intimate knowledge of household rhythms. What makes this profession particularly poignant is how it reveals the deep interconnectedness of pre-industrial communities. Your dawn runner wasn't just providing a service. They were maintaining the temporal structure that kept entire neighborhoods functioning. They were living embodiments of collective timekeeping, human chronometers, whose accuracy determined whether the day began in harmony or chaos. And perhaps most remarkably, they did all of this while navigating the streets in complete darkness, relying on memory, instinct, and years of accumulated knowledge about how sound travels through sleeping neighborhoods. They were acoustic engineers and social psychologists wrapped up in the humble profession of making sure people woke up on time. Those dawn runners navigating through darkness had it easy compared to the artisans, whose job was to turn aristocratic smiles into something that would make modern dentists weep. Welcome to the world of professional tooth blackening, where beauty standards required transforming pearly whites into what can only be described as deliberate dental nightmares. Ohaguro, literally black teeth, wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a complex chemical process that required genuine expertise, considerable danger, and an aesthetic sense that valued darkness over light in ways that still puzzle historians. The specialists who performed this transformation were part chemist, part artist, and part very patient person, willing to spend hours painting individual teeth with what was essentially controlled corrosion. The base ingredient was iron filings, dissolved in tea or sake, combined with gallnut extract from oak trees. This mixture created a chemical reaction that permanently stained teeth jet black. But here's the thing that makes this job particularly surreal. Getting the formula wrong could literally dissolve your client's teeth entirely. Too much acid, and you're looking at complete dental destruction. Too little, and the black coating would chip off within weeks, leaving embarrassing patches that screamed, "Amateur Ohaguro work." Professional tooth blackening specialists, or haguroshi, spent years perfecting their chemical knowledge. They understood the precise pH levels needed for different tooth types, how dietary habits affected absorption rates, and which seasonal variations in their ingredients required formula adjustments. Some maintained detailed records of successful mixtures, closely guarded trade secrets that could make or break their reputation. The application process was lengthy and uncomfortable. Clients would sit for hours while the specialist carefully painted each tooth with thin brushes made from bamboo fibers. The mixture had to be applied in multiple thin coats, with drying time between each layer. During this process, clients couldn't eat or drink anything that might compromise the chemical reaction. Conversation was discouraged because saliva production could dilute the mixture. But the real skill lay in achieving uniformity. Amateur tooth blackening was immediately recognizable by its uneven coverage, streaky appearance, or variations in darkness between teeth. Master practitioners could create perfectly uniform black surfaces that reflected light like polished obsidian. This level of precision required not just chemical knowledge, but artistic sensibility and incredibly steady hands. The clientele was exclusively high status. Married aristocratic women, court ladies, and the wives of wealthy merchants all required professional ohaguro services. The blackened teeth served multiple social functions. They indicated marital status, demonstrated wealth sufficient to afford the service, and supposedly made the face appear more beautiful by contrast. Contemporary poetry describes black teeth as enhancing the whiteness of the face and the redness of the lips. The health implications were genuinely concerning. The iron-tannin mixture was toxic if swallowed in significant quantities. Long-term exposure caused gum disease, tooth decay, and sometimes complete tooth loss. Professional tooth blackeners needed to work quickly and precisely to minimize their clients' exposure to these hazardous materials. They also provided aftercare instructions, including which foods to avoid and how to maintain the blackening without causing additional damage. Some specialists developed signature techniques. There were those who specialized in gradual blackening that looked more natural, others who could achieve mirror-like finishes, and a few who created subtle variations in darkness that supposedly enhanced different facial features. The most elite practitioners charged enormous fees and served only the highest court circles, where their work would be scrutinized by other aristocrats capable of recognizing superior craftsmanship. The tools were surprisingly sophisticated. Beyond the basic brushes, specialists used small mirrors to check their work, special oil lamps that provided consistent lighting, and various cleaning implements to prepare teeth for treatment. Some carried portable screens to create privacy during the lengthy application process, and most maintained supplies of antidotes in case clients accidentally ingested too much of the mixture. Training involved extensive apprenticeships, often lasting 5 to 7 years. Apprentices started by preparing ingredients, graduated to applying base coats under supervision, and finally learned the advanced techniques for achieving perfect uniformity and luster. The failure rate was high, both for apprentices who couldn't master the chemical precision, and for those who couldn't handle the social pressure of potentially disfiguring wealthy, powerful clients. What's particularly fascinating is how this profession intersected with broader Japanese aesthetics. The preference for blackened teeth reflected cultural values that associated darkness with depth, sophistication, and hidden beauty. It was part of a broader aesthetic that valued suggestion over revelation, darkness over brightness, concealment over display. The decline began in the Meiji period, when Western beauty standards started influencing Japanese fashion. Professional tooth blackeners found themselves increasingly obsolete as their clients embraced white teeth and Western dental care. Some retrained as conventional dental assistants, though their chemical knowledge often made them surprisingly effective at treating the dental problems their previous work had created. And yet, there's something almost admirable about the dedication required to master such a specialized, dangerous, and ultimately temporary art form. These craftspeople spent decades perfecting techniques that would leave their clients looking beautiful by the standards of their time, even as they slowly poisoned them with every application. Those steady hands were nothing compared to the spiritual dexterity required by Buddhist monks, who made their living consuming other people's sins. Not metaphorically, literally eating meals that were believed to transfer the spiritual pollution of dying aristocrats directly into their own souls. Welcome to the world of sin-eater monks, where dinner came with a side of eternal damnation. The practice emerged from a fascinating collision between Buddhist theology and Shinto concepts of spiritual pollution. When wealthy individuals approached death, they often carried what Buddhist doctrine called karmic debt, the accumulated spiritual weight of their earthly actions. This pollution, or kegare, was believed to contaminate not just the dying person, but potentially their entire household and lineage. Enter the sin-eater monks, religious specialists who offered to absorb this contamination through ritualized consumption. The process was elaborate and deeply unsettling. The dying person would confess their sins to the monk, who would then prepare a symbolic meal representing those transgressions. Each dish corresponded to different categories of wrongdoing: meat for violence, expensive delicacies for greed, bitter herbs for anger, spoiled food for corruption. The monk would consume this meal while meditating on the specific sins being transferred, essentially digesting the spiritual pollution along with the physical food. But here's where the job becomes truly bizarre. These weren't desperate monks taking on any work they could find. These were highly trained religious specialists who commanded enormous fees precisely because they were willing to damn themselves for their clients' spiritual convenience. The theological implications were staggering. They were essentially purchasing other people's salvation with their own souls. The training required was extensive and disturbing. Novice sin-eaters spent years studying the precise correspondence between different sins and their culinary representations. They learned meditation techniques designed to contain spiritual pollution within their own bodies, preventing it from spreading to others. Most importantly, they developed the psychological fortitude necessary to knowingly consume evil while maintaining their sanity. The meals themselves were often genuinely disgusting. Sins of violence might be represented by raw meat left to spoil for days. Sexual transgressions called for dishes combining ingredients in nauseating ways. Financial corruption required consuming actual coins or precious metals, which posed obvious health risks. The most elaborate sin-eating ceremonies involved multi-course meals that could take hours to consume, each bite representing another layer of spiritual contamination. What made this profession particularly tragic was its self-perpetuating nature. Each sin-eating session added to the monk's own karmic debt, making them spiritually heavier and more polluted. Experienced sin-eaters were believed to carry so much accumulated evil that they were essentially walking repositories of concentrated damnation. This made them simultaneously valuable as spiritual specialists and untouchable as social beings. The pay structure reflected these contradictions. Clients paid enormous sums, sometimes equivalent to years of normal monastic support, precisely because they understood the terrible cost to the sin-eater. But the monks themselves often lived in poverty, donating most of their fees to temples or using the money for elaborate purification rituals that never quite managed to cleanse their accumulated pollution. Some scholars debate whether sin-eating actually worked, according to Buddhist theology, or whether it was essentially an elaborate placebo that allowed wealthy people to feel better about their moral failures. The textual evidence is mixed, with some Buddhist authorities condemning the practice as theologically unsound, while others defended it as a legitimate form of compassionate self-sacrifice. The social dynamics were fascinating and horrible. Sin-eater monks occupied a strange position in the religious hierarchy, respected for their spiritual knowledge and feared for their accumulated pollution. They often lived in separate quarters, ate meals alone, and were avoided by other monks who worried about spiritual contamination through association. Yet they were also sought out by dying aristocrats who viewed them as essential to achieving a peaceful death. The physical toll was significant. Beyond the obvious health risks of consuming spoiled food and metal objects, sin-eaters often developed serious digestive problems, nutritional deficiencies, and psychological disorders. Contemporary medical texts describe symptoms that sound remarkably like what we'd now recognize as severe depression and anxiety, presumably from the constant awareness of carrying other people's spiritual pollution. The most elite sin-eaters developed specialties based on different types of transgressions. Some focused on political sins, corruption, betrayal, abuse of power. Others specialized in personal moral failures, adultery, greed, family abandonment. The most sought after could handle complex cases involving multiple categories of wrongdoing, requiring elaborate multi-day consumption rituals. What's particularly disturbing is how this profession reveals the transactional nature of medieval Japanese spirituality among the wealthy. Death became less about facing the consequences of your actions and more about finding the right religious specialist to handle the paperwork, so to speak. It was spiritual capitalism at its most literal, purchasing salvation through someone else's suffering. The decline came gradually as Buddhist philosophy evolved toward emphasizing personal responsibility and direct karma. By the late medieval period, most Buddhist authorities had rejected sin-eating as theologically invalid, though some remote monasteries apparently continued the practice into the early modern era. And yet, there's something deeply moving about monks willing to sacrifice their own spiritual welfare for others, even if the entire theological framework was questionable. They were perhaps the ultimate service providers, offering not just their time or expertise, but their eternal souls. While those sin-eater monks were consuming spiritual pollution, another group of professionals was manufacturing something equally artificial, but far more socially acceptable: grief. Professional mourners and fake relatives turned funeral attendance into theater, complete with scripted tears, rehearsed family histories, and performances so convincing that even the genuinely bereaved sometimes forgot who was real and who was hired help. The business emerged from a uniquely Japanese social anxiety. Dying without sufficient mourners was considered deeply shameful, not just for the deceased, but for their entire lineage. A sparsely attended funeral suggested either social failure or family dysfunction, neither of which wealthy families could afford to display publicly. Enter the professional mourners, who could transform a pathetic funeral into a spectacular display of grief and social connection. These weren't simply people hired to cry loudly. Professional mourners were skilled actors who specialized in different types of grief performance. There were the inconsolable widows, middle-aged women who could produce hours of authentic-seeming anguish. The devoted children who portrayed filial piety through specific postures, vocal patterns, and ritualized movements. The heartbroken friends who delivered eulogies filled with fabricated memories and fictional shared experiences. The most sophisticated operations involved entire fake families. When wealthy individuals died without close relatives, or when their actual relatives were too scandalous to appear publicly, professional mourning companies could provide complete fictitious family networks. Hired sons who knew detailed backstories about childhood experiences they'd never shared. Fake daughters who could recite family histories spanning decades. Pretend grandchildren who performed inherited grief with remarkable authenticity. The preparation process was extensive and slightly creepy. Professional mourners researched their clients, like method actors preparing for major roles. They studied the deceased's actual life history, memorized names of real friends and associates, and learned enough biographical details to convincingly portray intimate relationships. Some maintained detailed files on multiple deceased individuals, ready to perform different grief roles as needed. The training involved studying actual grief patterns. Master mourners understood the physical manifestations of different types of loss, how a parent's death differed from a spouse's death, how sudden loss presented differently from long illness. They practiced specific crying techniques, learned to produce tears on command, and mastered the subtle body language of authentic sorrow. Some developed signature mourning styles that became sought after by discerning funeral organizers. But here's where the job becomes truly surreal. The emotional labor involved in repeatedly performing intense grief for strangers. Professional mourners spent their working lives cycling through intense emotional states, producing authentic-seeming anguish on schedule, then transitioning back to normal life between performances. The psychological toll was significant, with many mourners developing actual depression from constant exposure to artificial tragedy. The pay structure reflected the performance complexity. Basic mourning, standing quietly and looking sad, was relatively inexpensive. Vocal grief with crying and wailing commanded higher fees. Full dramatic performances, complete with fainting spells and need for physical restraint, were premium services. Fake family members who needed to interact convincingly with real relatives and deliver personal eulogies earned the highest rates. The most elite mourners developed specialties. Some focused on military funerals, learning appropriate martial grief behaviors and memorizing military terminology. Others specialized in merchant funerals, understanding commercial relationships and business mourning protocols. The truly high-end performers could handle court funerals, where their fake grief needed to convince actual aristocrats who might have known the deceased personally. Quality control was crucial and slightly horrifying. Funeral organizers would observe mourning performances, noting which mourners produced the most convincing tears, who could maintain emotional intensity for the longest periods, and whose fake family interactions seemed most authentic. Poor performers were blacklisted, while exceptional mourners built reputations that allowed them to command premium fees. The props and costumes were surprisingly elaborate. Professional mourners maintained wardrobes of appropriate funeral clothing for different social classes and occasions. They carried small onions or pepper to induce tears if natural production failed during performances. Some used subtle makeup techniques to create the appearance of prolonged crying, reddened eyes, pale complexion, slightly swollen features that suggested recent emotional trauma. What made this profession particularly bizarre was how it intersected with genuine grief. Real family members would find themselves surrounded by hired mourners whose artificial anguish often exceeded their own authentic sorrow. Some reported feeling inadequate at their own relatives' funerals, unable to match the dramatic grief being performed by professional mourners who had never known the deceased. The social dynamics were complex and uncomfortable. Professional mourners needed to balance their performances carefully, convincing enough to enhance the funeral's respectability, but not so dramatic as to overshadow genuine family members. They had to navigate conversations with real acquaintances of the deceased, maintaining fictional relationships while avoiding contradictions that might expose the deception. Some mourners developed genuine attachments to their regular clients, families who hired them repeatedly for different family funerals. These mourners accumulated detailed knowledge of family histories, developing almost authentic relationships with people who paid them to fake grief. The boundary between performance and reality became increasingly blurred. The decline came with changing funeral customs and increased skepticism about elaborate mourning displays. By the modern period, professional mourning was viewed as somewhat tacky, though some rural areas maintained the tradition. Many former mourners transitioned into related fields: theater, ceremonial services, or wedding performance, where their acting skills remained valuable. Professional lice pickers, or shiramitori, were skilled specialists who understood both the mechanics of elaborate hairstyles and the life cycles of various parasites. They needed to remove unwanted inhabitants without disrupting the carefully constructed hair arrangements, a task requiring extraordinary patience, steady hands, and detailed knowledge of structural hair engineering. The work was intimate and oddly meditative. Lice prickers would spend hours carefully parting sections of hair, searching for evidence of infestation, and removing individual parasites with specialized tools. The process required examining every strand of hair, often while the client remained perfectly still to avoid disturbing their elaborate coiffure. Conversations during these sessions were necessarily quiet and minimal, creating an atmosphere of focused, almost ritualistic concentration. The tools were surprisingly sophisticated. Master lice pickers used fine ivory combs with teeth spaced at precise intervals for different types of parasites. They carried small bronze tweezers for removing individual lice, tiny brushes for cleaning hair sections, and magnifying lenses made from polished crystal for detailed examination. Some maintained collections of specialized implements for different hair textures and styling techniques. But here's where the job becomes particularly challenging. These elaborate hairstyles weren't just decorative. They were political statements, social indicators, and artistic expressions that communicated complex messages about status, marital availability, and court affiliations. A lice picker who accidentally damaged a crucial element of the hairstyle could potentially disrupt important social communications, making their work both medically necessary and diplomatically sensitive. The training involved learning about different types of hair parasites and their behaviors. Lice pickers studied the life cycles of various insects, understanding which were seasonal, which preferred certain hair products, and which were likely to indicate broader health problems. They also learned about hair care techniques, understanding how different oils and treatments affected both hair health and parasite populations. The social dynamics were complex and slightly uncomfortable. Lice pickers were essential service providers who had unprecedented intimate access to their clients, yet they occupied relatively low social positions. They were privy to private conversations, personal health information, and family secrets, but were expected to maintain complete discretion. The relationship was simultaneously intimate and hierarchical, professional and personal. Quality control involved not just parasite removal, but also monitoring overall scalp health. Experienced lice pickers could identify early signs of skin conditions, nutritional deficiencies, and other health problems through careful examination of hair and scalp condition. Some developed informal medical expertise, though they were careful not to overstep into territory reserved for official court physicians. The most skilled practitioners developed reputations for being able to work completely undetected. They could remove parasites so efficiently and quietly that clients could maintain conversations, receive other beauty treatments, or even sleep during the process. This level of skill commanded premium fees and led to exclusive arrangements with the highest-ranking court ladies. The pay structure reflected both the essential nature of the service and its somewhat embarrassing necessity. Regular maintenance sessions were relatively affordable, but emergency treatments, removing serious infestations before important court appearances, commanded higher fees. The most elite lice pickers also provided consulting services, advising on hair care techniques that could prevent future infestations. Some lice pickers expanded their services to include general hair maintenance, scalp massage, and application of various treatments designed to promote hair health and discourage parasites. They became informal beauty specialists, though always within the narrow confines of maintaining existing hairstyles rather than creating new ones. What makes this profession particularly fascinating is how it reveals the gap between public appearance and private reality in court culture. The elaborate, pristine hairstyles that communicated sophistication and refinement required constant, invisible maintenance by specialists, whose very existence acknowledged the less glamorous biological realities underlying aristocratic beauty. The work also required considerable psychological resilience. Dealing with severe infestations could be genuinely disgusting, and the intimate nature of the work meant that lice pickers were exposed to their clients' personal hygiene problems in ways that were both necessary and potentially traumatic. Some developed strong stomach tolerances that served them well, while others eventually left the profession due to the constant exposure to parasites and unpleasant odors. The decline came gradually, with changing hygiene practices and simpler hairstyles that could be washed more frequently. As court culture evolved and bathing became more common, the demand for professional lice picking decreased significantly. Many former lice pickers transitioned into more general hair care services, though some rural areas maintained the practice well into the modern period. Those steady hands examining hair for parasites were nothing compared to the precision required by blindfolded food tasters, whose job was to identify potentially lethal poisons through taste alone, often while literally unable to see what they were consuming. In a political environment where assassination by poisoning was a genuine occupational hazard for the powerful, someone needed to stand between the aristocracy and their dinner, and that someone was usually willing to die for surprisingly modest wages. Professional food tasters, or dokumiyaku, weren't simply people who ate things first. They were trained specialists who could identify dozens of different poisons through subtle taste variations, detect contamination in complex dishes, and make split-second decisions about whether food was safe for consumption. Many worked blindfolded to enhance their other senses and to prevent visual bias from affecting their judgment about food safety. The training process was both extensive and genuinely dangerous. Apprentice tasters spent years developing their palates under master practitioners who taught them to identify the subtle flavor signatures of different toxic substances. They learned to recognize the metallic taste of mercury, the bitter undertones of arsenic, the slightly sweet notes of certain plant toxins, and the distinctive burning sensation that accompanied caustic substances. But here's where the job becomes truly terrifying. The learning process involved deliberate exposure to small amounts of actual poisons. Trainees would consume controlled doses of various toxic substances to familiarize themselves with their taste profiles, building tolerance while learning recognition techniques. Many apprentices died during training, making this one of the few professions where the educational process was literally life-threatening. The work required extraordinary sensory awareness. Master food tasters could detect poisoning attempts through incredibly subtle changes in flavor, texture, or aroma. They understood how different cooking methods might mask or enhance poison flavors, how various spices could be used to disguise toxic substances, and which combinations of ingredients might indicate deliberate contamination rather than accidental spoilage. The tools were minimal but crucial. Most tasters carried small silver instruments that would change color when exposed to certain poisons, though they relied primarily on their enhanced senses rather than mechanical detection. Some used tiny amounts of neutralizing substances, milk, activated charcoal, or specific antidotes that could counteract certain poisons if consumed quickly enough after detection. The psychological pressure was enormous. Food tasters needed to make rapid decisions about potentially lethal substances while maintaining a calm demeanor that wouldn't alarm their employers or dinner guests. They had to balance thoroughness with speed, ensuring comprehensive testing without delaying meals to the point of social awkwardness. A single mistake could result in their employer's death, and probably their own execution for failure. The blindfolding technique was both practical and ritualistic. Working without sight forced tasters to rely entirely on taste, smell, and texture, enhancing their ability to detect subtle abnormalities. But it also served as a form of protection, preventing them from being influenced by the appearance of food or the identity of those serving it. Some tasters developed such acute non-visual senses that they could identify specific cooks, detect emotional states in food preparers, and even recognize when dishes had been prepared by nervous or frightened kitchen staff. What made this profession particularly grim was its mortality rate. Even experienced tasters occasionally encountered new poisons or substance combinations they couldn't identify quickly enough. Some died from accumulated exposure to small amounts of toxins over years of testing. Others were killed by employers who suspected them of being complicit in poisoning attempts, making loyalty just as dangerous as the poisons themselves. The pay was surprisingly modest, considering the risks involved. Most food tasters earned steady but unexceptional wages, with the primary compensation being housing, meals, and medical care, rather than significant monetary payment. The job security was excellent for those who survived. Experienced tasters were valuable enough that they rarely faced unemployment, but the career prospects were obviously limited by life expectancy. Some tasters developed specialties based on different types of cuisine or specific categories of poisons. There were those who focused on identifying plant-based toxins, others who specialized in mineral poisons, and a few who could detect biological contamination or deliberate food spoilage. The most elite tasters served multiple employers, traveling between different households and providing specialized consulting services. The social status was oddly complex. Food tasters were essential service providers whose survival was literally connected to their employers' well-being, creating relationships of mutual dependence. Yet, they were also constant reminders of mortality and political vulnerability, making their presence simultaneously reassuring and disturbing for those they served. Quality control involved regular testing of the tasters themselves. Employers would occasionally present deliberately contaminated food to verify their tasters' continued effectiveness, or would use multiple tasters for important meals to ensure comprehensive coverage. These tests were sometimes fatal when tasters failed to identify poisons correctly, making the job even more stressful. What's particularly disturbing about this profession is how it reveals the paranoid nature of feudal Japanese political culture. The need for professional food tasters suggests that poisoning attempts were common enough to justify the expense and complexity of maintaining dedicated specialists. It was a profession that existed only because murder was a routine part of political life. The decline came gradually, with changing political structures and improved food safety practices. As centralized authority reduced the frequency of assassination attempts, the demand for professional food tasters decreased. Many former tasters transitioned into more general culinary roles, though their enhanced palates often made them valuable as flavor consultants or quality control specialists. wealthy from what everyone else considered worthless waste. In a pre-industrial society where fertilizer was crucial for agriculture, someone needed to collect, process, and distribute the human waste that kept the entire food system functioning. Professional night soil collectors, or shimogoya, weren't desperate people scraping together subsistence livings. They were often successful business people who understood that waste management was both essential infrastructure and lucrative commercial opportunity. The best night soil operations were sophisticated enterprises involving collection routes, processing facilities, quality control standards, and distribution networks that would make modern logistics companies proud. The collection process was surprisingly organized and efficient. Night soil collectors maintained regular routes through urban neighborhoods, arriving at predictable times to empty household waste containers. They used specialized equipment, wooden buckets with tight-fitting lids, wheeled carts for efficient transport, and various tools for handling different types of waste. The work required physical strength, organizational skills, and the ability to navigate urban environments while transporting heavy, unpleasant cargo. But here's where this job becomes genuinely fascinating. The economics were surprisingly favorable. Human waste was valuable agricultural fertilizer, and night soil collectors could charge both for collection services and for selling the processed material to farmers. The most successful operations developed exclusive contracts with wealthy neighborhoods, guaranteeing steady supply of high-quality waste from well-fed households, whose excrement was considered premium fertilizer. The processing techniques were complex and surprisingly scientific. Different types of waste required different handling methods to maximize their agricultural value. Night soil collectors understood fermentation processes, composting techniques, and the chemical changes that transformed raw sewage into effective fertilizer. They maintained processing facilities where waste was aged, mixed with other organic materials, and prepared for agricultural use. Quality control was crucial and slightly disturbing. Experienced collectors could assess the fertilizer value of waste based on its source, consistency, and other characteristics that are probably best left undetailed. They understood which neighborhoods produced waste with higher nitrogen content, which households' waste indicated better nutrition, and thus better fertilizer potential, and how seasonal dietary changes affected the agricultural value of collected material. The tools and equipment were specialized and constantly evolving. Beyond basic collection implements, successful night soil operations used processing equipment, storage facilities, and transportation systems designed to handle large volumes of waste efficiently. Some developed innovative techniques for reducing odors, speeding decomposition, and improving the final product's effectiveness as fertilizer. The social dynamics were complex and surprisingly respectful. While night soil collectors handled material that everyone else considered disgusting, they provided essential services that kept cities functioning and agriculture productive. Many developed regular relationships with their clients, who appreciated reliable waste removal and often paid premium rates for consistent, professional service. What made this profession particularly interesting was how it intersected with urban planning and public health. Night soil collectors were essentially early sanitation engineers, understanding waste flow patterns, urban hygiene requirements, and the connections between waste management and disease prevention. Their work was crucial for maintaining urban environments where large populations could live in relative health and safety. The most successful collectors expanded into related services. Some developed expertise in different types of organic waste, collecting and processing materials from breweries, restaurants, and other businesses that generated valuable compostable material. Others specialized in serving particular types of clients, wealthy households, commercial establishments, or entire neighborhoods that required customized waste management solutions. The pay could be surprisingly good, especially for collectors who developed efficient operations and exclusive client relationships. While the work was unpleasant, the demand was constant. The competition was limited by the nature of the work, and the profit margins could be substantial for those who mastered both collection and processing aspects of the business. Training involved learning both the practical aspects of waste handling and the business skills necessary for successful operations. Apprentices learned collection techniques, processing methods, client relations, and the agricultural knowledge necessary to produce high-quality fertilizer. The most successful collectors understood their entire supply chain, from urban waste generation to agricultural application. Some night soil collectors developed reputations for particular expertise. There were those known for serving wealthy districts, others who specialized in commercial waste, and a few who developed innovative processing techniques that produced superior fertilizer. The most elite operations commanded premium prices and maintained waiting lists of farmers eager to purchase their processed products. What's particularly remarkable about this profession is how it turns society's most unwanted material into valuable commercial products. Night soil collectors were essentially early recycling entrepreneurs, understanding that waste was only waste if you couldn't find profitable uses for it. They transformed urban sanitation problems into agricultural solutions, creating value from material that everyone else was eager to dispose of. The decline came with modern sanitation systems and chemical fertilizers that replaced human waste as agricultural inputs. But during their heyday, night soil collectors were crucial infrastructure providers whose work kept cities livable and farms productive. Some became genuinely wealthy, proving that success could come from the most unlikely sources. Those night soil collectors, transforming waste into agricultural gold, had nothing on the obsessive perfectionism required by tea whisk carvers, whose entire professional existence revolved around creating single bamboo implements that would be used for perhaps 30 minutes and then discarded. In a culture where tea ceremony represented the pinnacle of aesthetic refinement, someone needed to spend years perfecting tools so ephemeral that their value lay entirely in the precision of their temporary function. Professional tea whisk carvers, or chasen-shi, weren't simply craftspeople making utilitarian kitchen implements. They were artists, whose work required understanding bamboo at a molecular level, mastering techniques passed down through generations, and accepting that their life's work would be measured in implements designed for brief, perfect moments, rather than lasting monuments to their skill. The creation process was extraordinarily time-consuming and required almost supernatural patience. A single tea whisk involved selecting the perfect piece of bamboo, not just any bamboo, but bamboo of specific age, cut at the correct season, from plants growing in particular soil conditions. The bamboo needed to be aged for months or even years before it was suitable for carving, and masters could identify optimal materials through subtle variations in color, texture, and flexibility that would be invisible to untrained eyes. The carving itself was meditation made manifest. Each whisk required splitting a single piece of bamboo into dozens of incredibly thin tines, each one precisely shaped and positioned to create the exact turbulence patterns necessary for proper tea preparation. The work was done entirely by hand, using specialized knives that were themselves works of art, passed down through families of carvers who guarded their techniques like state secrets. But here's where this profession becomes truly obsessive. The quality standards were so exacting that master carvers would destroy weeks of work over microscopic imperfections that would be undetectable to anyone except other tea ceremony practitioners. A single tine that was slightly too thick, a fractional asymmetry in the overall shape, or a minor variation in the splitting pattern would render an otherwise perfect whisk completely unacceptable. The training process lasted decades and had an extraordinarily high failure rate. Apprentices spent years learning to select appropriate bamboo before they were even allowed to touch carving tools. They practiced splitting techniques on practice pieces, developed the hand strength and precision necessary for detailed work, and studied the aesthetic principles that governed proper whisk design. Most apprentices never progressed beyond basic utility whisks, and only a tiny fraction ever achieved master status. The tools were as specialized as the techniques. Master carvers used knives forged specifically for bamboo work, with blade angles and metal compositions designed for splitting fibers rather than cutting them. They maintained sets of measuring instruments so precise they could detect variations invisible to normal measurement. And many developed personal techniques for testing bamboo flexibility, grain direction, and other characteristics that affected the final product. What made this profession particularly fascinating was how it intersected with tea ceremony philosophy. The whisk wasn't just a tool for mixing tea, it was a spiritual implement whose perfect function was supposed to embody principles of harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. Carvers weren't just making kitchen utensils, they were creating objects that would facilitate transcendent aesthetic experiences. The economics were strange and somewhat tragic. Master quality tea whisks commanded enormous prices, sometimes equivalent to months of normal wages. But they were designed to be used briefly and then discarded. The most exquisite whisks might be used for a single tea ceremony and then thrown away, making this one of the few art forms where the goal was creating perfect objects designed for immediate obsolescence. The social status of whisk carvers was oddly elevated. While they worked with their hands and created utilitarian objects, Their deep understanding of aesthetic principles and their role in facilitating tea ceremony gave them access to elite cultural circles. Master carvers were consulted on matters of taste and design, far beyond their specific craft, and some became influential figures in broader artistic communities. Quality control involved testing each whisk's functional performance in actual tea preparation. Carvers needed to understand not just the mechanical aspects of their craft, but the practical requirements of tea ceremony. They studied how different whisk designs affected tea texture, foam production, and the subtle aesthetic elements that made tea ceremony spiritually meaningful rather than merely functional. Some carvers developed signature styles that became sought after by particular tea ceremony schools or individual practitioners. There were those known for whisks that produced particularly fine foam, others whose work was prized for its visual elegance, and a few whose whisks were believed to enhance the spiritual aspects of tea preparation through their perfect embodiment of aesthetic principles. The most elite carvers worked exclusively for specific tea masters or ceremony schools, creating bespoke whisks designed for particular ceremonies or seasonal celebrations. These relationships often lasted decades, with carvers developing intimate understanding of their clients' aesthetic preferences and ceremonial requirements. What's particularly poignant about this profession is how it embodied Japanese aesthetic values that prioritized process over product, perfection over permanence, and spiritual significance over material durability. Whisk carvers spent their entire careers perfecting techniques for creating objects whose highest purpose was their own transcendence through use. The decline came gradually, as tea ceremony became less central to elite culture, and mass-produced whisks became available for casual tea preparation. But during their heyday, master whisk carvers were guardians of aesthetic standards so refined that their work elevated simple bamboo into instruments of spiritual transformation. Those bamboo carvers, perfecting ephemeral implements, had nothing on the mystical precision required by dream interpreters and sleep watchers, whose job was to monitor the unconscious minds of the powerful and translate nighttime visions into daytime political strategy. In a culture where dreams were considered direct communication from spiritual realms, someone needed to stay awake all night, watching other people sleep, then providing detailed analysis of their subconscious experiences for use in making crucial governmental decisions. Professional dream interpreters, or yume uranai, weren't simply fortune tellers making vague predictions based on symbolic imagery. They were sophisticated analysts who combined psychological observation, political intelligence, and spiritual interpretation to transform the sleeping experiences of their clients into actionable guidance for complex political situations. Their work required understanding both the mechanics of sleep and the intricate dynamics of court politics. The observation process was both intimate and intensely boring. Sleep watchers would spend entire nights sitting beside sleeping clients, monitoring their breathing patterns, facial expressions, body movements, and vocal utterances during different sleep phases. They needed to identify when dreams were occurring, assess their apparent intensity, and carefully record any verbal or physical reactions that might provide clues about dream content. But here's where this job becomes genuinely strange. The interpretation required combining dream analysis with detailed knowledge of current political situations, family dynamics, and potential future scenarios that might be relevant to the dreamer's waking life. Dream interpreters needed to be part psychologist, part political analyst, and part fortune teller, translating subconscious imagery into practical advice about everything from military strategy to marriage negotiations. The training involved studying traditional dream symbolism, learning to recognize different types of sleep patterns, and developing expertise in political analysis that would allow them to connect dream imagery with real-world situations. Master interpreters understood the standard symbolic meanings: dragons representing imperial power, water indicating change, fire suggesting conflict. But they also needed to customize interpretations based on individual dreamers' personal histories and current circumstances. The tools were minimal, but surprisingly sophisticated. Sleep watchers used special cushions, positioned to provide optimal observation angles. Low-burning candles or oil lamps that provided enough light for observation without disturbing sleep. And detailed record-keeping materials for documenting sleep patterns and dream indicators. Some carried small mirrors to observe subtle facial changes, and most maintained extensive reference materials covering dream symbolism and interpretation techniques. What made this profession particularly challenging was the need to balance accuracy with political utility. Dream interpreters couldn't simply provide literal translations of dream imagery. They needed to craft interpretations that would be useful for their clients' actual decision-making, while maintaining credibility as spiritual guidance. A dream about falling might be interpreted as a warning about political vulnerability, advice to be more cautious in current negotiations, or encouragement to take calculated risks, depending on the political context. The social dynamics were complex and potentially dangerous. Dream interpreters had unprecedented intimate access to their clients, observing them in their most vulnerable states and gaining insights into their subconscious fears, desires, and concerns. This knowledge made them simultaneously valuable and threatening, trusted advisors who could potentially use their intimate knowledge for blackmail or political manipulation. Quality control involved tracking the accuracy of interpretations over time, though this was complicated by the subjective nature of dream analysis and the multiple ways that predictions might be considered fulfilled. Successful interpreters developed reputations for providing guidance that proved useful, while those whose interpretations consistently failed to provide valuable insights found themselves quickly unemployed, and sometimes worse. The most skilled practitioners developed specialties based on different types of dreams or particular categories of political situations. Some focused on military dreams, interpreting imagery related to warfare and strategy. Others specialized in diplomatic dreams, analyzing visions that might provide guidance for negotiations or alliance building. The truly elite could handle complex prophetic dreams that supposedly provided insights into long-term political developments. The pay structure reflected both the specialized nature of the work and its potential political value. Basic dream interpretation commanded modest fees, but interpreters who provided consistently valuable political guidance could earn substantial compensation and gain significant influence within court circles. The most successful often became informal political advisors, whose influence extended far beyond their official dream interpretation duties. Some interpreters expanded their services to include broader sleep-related consulting. They advised on optimal sleeping arrangements for better dreams, recommended dietary changes that might influence dream content, and provided guidance on sleep rituals designed to encourage spiritually significant visions. A few developed expertise in induced dreaming techniques, though these practices were considered somewhat dangerous and were generally restricted to the most experienced practitioners. What's particularly fascinating about this profession is how it reveals the intersection between personal psychology and political power in feudal Japanese culture. Dream interpreters were essentially early political psychologists, using insights into their clients' subconscious minds to provide guidance for conscious decision-making. They understood that political leaders' personal fears, desires, and psychological patterns could significantly influence governmental decisions. The decline came gradually as political structures became more rationalized and less dependent on spiritual guidance for major decisions. Western influence during the modern period reduced the cultural importance of dream interpretation, though some rural areas maintained the practice well into recent times. Many former dream interpreters transitioned into more conventional advisory roles, though their psychological insights often made them valuable counselors, even without the mystical framework. Those detailed records of sleep patterns and dream imagery were maintained with extraordinary care, because the interpreters understood that their clients' subconscious minds contained information that could determine the fate of entire domains. But even this level of precision pales compared to our final profession, where the margin for error was measured not in political embarrassment, but in the difference between honorable death and eternal shame. And so we arrive at perhaps the most solemn, precise, and peculiarly intimate profession in all of feudal Japan, the kaishakunin, or suicide assistant. Yes, you heard that correctly. In a society where honor meant everything, and dishonor meant a very specific something involving a sharp blade and your own abdomen, there emerged a class of individuals whose entire livelihood depended on helping people die with dignity. It's rather like being a wedding planner, except instead of coordinating flowers and seating charts, you're coordinating the final moments of someone's existence. And the dress code was significantly more somber. The kaishakunin wasn't just anyone with a sword and a steady hand, though those qualities certainly helped. These were typically samurai themselves, chosen for their unwavering loyalty, impeccable swordsmanship, and what we might generously call professional discretion. After all, when your job involves watching your lord, friend, or fellow warrior commit ritual suicide, then delivering the coup de grace with surgical precision, you need nerves of absolute steel. Think of them as the ultimate wingmen, except instead of helping you approach someone at a tavern, they're helping you approach the afterlife with your reputation intact. The ritual of seppuku, or harakiri, if you prefer the more colloquial term, was far from the chaotic, desperate affair you might imagine. It was choreographed with the precision of a tea ceremony, and every bit as steeped in tradition. The kaishakunin played a crucial role in this deadly ballet, standing slightly behind and to the left of the person committing seppuku, katana at the ready. Their job was to strike at the precise moment when the ritual blade had done its work, but before the agony became unbearable. Too early, and you've dishonored the person's final act of courage. Too late, and you've allowed unnecessary suffering. The timing had to be absolutely perfect, a split-second window that separated mercy from failure. Training to become a kaishakunin required years of practice, though presumably not with live subjects. They would practice on straw dummies, perfecting the angle, the speed, and the follow-through necessary to deliver a clean, instant death. The strike had to sever the head almost completely, but not quite. Leaving the head attached by a thin strip of skin was considered the mark of true expertise. Preventing the rather unseemly spectacle of a head rolling across the floor like a wayward melon. Scholars debate whether this partial beheading was purely aesthetic or served some deeper spiritual purpose, though most agree it was probably preferable to having to chase after runaway craniums during what was supposed to be a dignified ceremony. The relationship between the person committing seppuku and their kaishakunin was extraordinarily intimate and trusting. Often, the kaishakunin was chosen by the dying person themselves, a close friend, a trusted retainer, or a fellow samurai whose skill was beyond question. In some cases, the kaishakunin might be the very person who had been ordered to oversee the seppuku in the first place, adding another layer of complexity to an already emotionally fraught situation. Imagine being told, "Please ensure my honorable death goes smoothly, and also, could you be a dear and cut my head off when the time comes?" It's the sort of request that really tests the boundaries of friendship. The tools of the kaishakunin's trade were as specialized as those of any craftsman. The katana used for the final blow was typically longer and heavier than a standard sword, chosen specifically for its ability to deliver a decisive cut. Some kaishakunin carried special blades reserved exclusively for this purpose, treating them with the same reverence a priest might show a sacred relic. The positioning, the grip, the breathing, every aspect was refined through practice and tradition. And unlike other professions we've encountered, there was absolutely no room for error. A botched execution didn't just mean professional embarrassment, it meant condemning someone to a prolonged and agonizing death. The psychological toll of being a kaishakunin must have been extraordinary. These men, and they were invariably men, witnessed some of the most profound moments of human courage and despair, often involving people they knew personally. Some kaishakunin served in this capacity dozens of times throughout their careers, accumulating a catalog of final moments that would make a modern therapist reach for their strongest medication. Yet they carried on, bound by duty and honor, to provide this grim service with unwavering professionalism. There were variations in the kaishakunin's role, depending on the circumstances of the seppuku. In cases of judicial seppuku, essentially a death sentence carried out by the condemned person themselves, the kaishakunin might be appointed by the authorities to ensure the sentence was properly executed. In voluntary seppuku, performed to restore honor or follow a deceased lord in death, the kaishakunin was typically chosen by the dying person. Some kaishakunin specialized in particular types of ceremonies, becoming known for their expertise in handling the unique requirements of different social classes or circumstances. The decline of the kaishakunin profession came gradually, as Japan moved away from feudal traditions and ritual suicide became less common. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 brought sweeping changes to Japanese society, and while seppuku didn't disappear entirely overnight, it became increasingly rare. The last recorded instances of kaishakunin services occurred well into the 20th century, though by then it had become more of an anachronistic curiosity than a regular profession. Modern Japan, understandably, has found other ways to deal with questions of honor and disgrace, though one suspects the insurance paperwork would be significantly more complicated if the Kaishakunin Guild were still in operation. What's particularly striking about the Kaishakunin is how they embodied the complex intersection of compassion and violence that characterized so much of samurai culture. Here were individuals whose entire purpose was to end suffering through the infliction of death, a paradox that would make philosophers scratch their heads for centuries. They were simultaneously executioners and mercy givers, friends and killers, servants of both honor and release. In a society obsessed with duty and proper form, they ensured that even death was done correctly. As we reach the end of our journey through feudal Japan's most unusual occupations, the kaishakunin serves as a fitting final example of how deeply intertwined duty, honor, and service were in this remarkable society. From the earwax cleaners to the suicide assistants, each profession filled a specific need, no matter how bizarre it might seem to modern eyes. These weren't just jobs, they were callings, bound up in the complex web of obligation and tradition that held feudal society together. And so, after wandering through centuries of peculiar professions and meeting the people who made their living in ways that would perplex modern career counselors, we find ourselves at the end of our tale. The kaishakunin, with their solemn duty and precise blade work, remind us that honor took many forms in feudal Japan, and that someone always had to be there to help others maintain it, right up until their very last breath. And here we are, at the end of our wandering path through the strange and wonderful world of feudal Japan's most unusual occupations. From the dedicated individuals who cleaned ears with the precision of surgeons, to those who helped others die with dignity, we've met people whose lives were shaped by duty, tradition, and the endless human capacity to find meaning in the most unexpected places. These weren't just curiosities or historical oddities. They were real people living real lives, bound by the same hopes, fears, and obligations that move us all. The tea whipper perfecting their foam, the sake taster risking their liver for the perfect brew, the professional apologizer smoothing over social wrinkles, the night soil collector maintaining society's most basic needs. Each played their part in keeping the world turning, one small service at a time. Let these stories settle gently in your mind as you drift towards sleep. Picture the quiet dedication of the incense clock keeper, marking time in fragrant spirals of smoke. Feel the careful precision of the ear cleaner's tools, the weight of responsibility on the kaishakunin's shoulders, the simple pride of work well done, no matter how strange that work might seem. Sleep comes easier when we remember that humans have always found ways to care for each other, to create meaning from necessity, and to build lives of purpose from the most unlikely materials. Close your eyes now. Let these gentle ghosts of history fade into dreams, and rest knowing that someone, somewhere, has always been looking after the details that make life possible.